Okay, first of all, thanks for your attention, and probably share with you something that we had in our last session with Alejandro Maitin, that is location. I think location is very important when we talk about this practices that are contextual and situated. Then here you are, of course, in Kunshan or in many other parts of the world, but let's say this is the starting point. And let's travel to the Atrato. Atrato River Colombia, right there it was. And this is going to be the journey, jumping all the way through the Pacific to Colombia, to the Atrato River. Then this is the northern tip of South America. The nation is Colombia, and the Atrato is right here. This long river that actually is born in right here, very close to the Pacific Ocean, less than 50 kilometers actually from the Pacific Ocean, but the river delta is in the Caribbean, in this Gulf. And it's a very interesting location. And it's a completely still green, mostly space, very deep green space, tropical forest that is called the Chocó Basin, that actually is separated from the Amazon by the Andean range. Then during one of the geological, when the earth was forming, the Amazon, that is this big green, vast area still, of course, encroaching many places, as you can see, was separated from this tip. Then this shares more or less the same biodiversity than the Amazon does, but because it was separated, something like, for example, Madagascar was separated from Africa, right, during one of these geological eras, and Madagascar has its own biodiversity, right? Evolution, the endemic species are very different from the rest of tropical Africa. Australia is another example, right? It's separated from the massive continent, and it has its own particular species that differ very much from the rest of the species that are, let's say, on the same latitude. That happens in Chocó. And what we saw, that film, was basically a trip from the city of Itzmina to the delta in this Gulf. And as I told you, is a space that is not urbanized whatsoever. It's quite a green space still. The living conditions are very tough because of pluviosity, because of tropical diseases, because it's a very deep and wet jungle. And nonetheless, there is lots of life in the riverbanks, like, let's say, water towns, but in a kind of a different configuration. And anyone will be great if you share what you saw, or if something that called your attention in the things you saw in this mostly experimental piece. when, in particular, with respect to the urban spaces you saw. An image that caught your attention, that would be a good way to start. Anyone? Or about the music or something that caught your attention in this?
Miguel, I don't want to be selfish here, but I'll comment on something I saw, and it connects to the screening we had a week ago here with Alejandro Metin and Casarillo, and both of the works of Casarillo and Más ARTE-ACCION, the Atrato film we saw, account for a legacy of violence and a complex of different social relations embedded in this. And so we have these very different art projects that engage a number of distinct communities that are caught in these webs of environmental and social exploitation at the same time. And so I was struck by the use of historical images in the Atrato River scene and its juxtaposition with contemporary practices. Yeah, it's really interesting connections.
You're exactly right. If you think about what Alejandro Baitin was saying, is that in their work or defending by social mapping the basin of the La Plata River, they have found this collision of forces, right? One is the force of capital, and then is the populations, right? What happens, the social dimension. And this clash has produced some sort of violence. If we think about this river, the Atrato River, we have to go back to the colonial period in which, and the why colonization happened, right? Yes, one was the creation of territories outside of Europe in order to sustain economies of a scale that were dwindling during the 1500s due to several issues. One of those was actually plagues and wars, and they needed supply, they needed resources, right? And images that you saw in this film were about dirt, right? Soil, like rocks, about mining, right? These rivers are full of minerals. Actually is an interesting also scientific data. In the Chocó Basin, actually in this river, platinum was discovered 350 years ago. Platinum is this very rare metal that actually is short in supply. And the first place in which was industrially mined was in the Chocó Basin. They depleted all the reserves of platinum in the Chocó and in the riverbanks of many of the tributaries of Atrato, of this river. And then a second wave of course, gold extraction happened. And nowadays, mining is still be present, mostly illegal mining. Why? Because this space, because of its isolation, its remoteness, because it's tough, right, physically to live there, and because of the configuration of these nations that are the result of these colonial forces that didn't allow for governance of territories, but everything was centralized, right? The empire was, making every decision in the center of the empire. And when these nations, through independence and anti-colonial resistance, created the nations, they somehow repeated the same models of centralization, then most of the governance, like in China, more or less, in a lesser degree, of course, everything is centralized in the capital city of these nations. In this case, the city is in the middle of the mountains, hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers away from these places. These places don't have governance. And then, because it's not governance, there is not the administration of justice or the presence of the state, then most of the things that happen there are not regulated. It wouldn't be a problem for communities that live, in sync and attune with the resources they have in a river, like indigenous communities or Afro-descendant communities that had developed their ways of living within this biocultural corridors. But the problem is when there is a resource like gold, or because of its remoteness, there is another resource, land, to, for example, plant illegal crops like coca or poppy, or there is free logging without any regulation. These resources become part of capital, and then violence comes, right? Because there is no governance, there is not a monopoly of the use of force by the state, then multiple forces come into play, and then violence happens. You saw in many of the images too, emptiness, right? Very simple urban developments, right? Real wooden houses, very poor, very simple, very humble houses, completely empty. This region has seen in the past 20 years forced displacement in a level that is comparable to a civil war, a massive civil war. Then are places that are also suffering depopulation and deterritorialization due to these capital forces that want to control not only the territory because of its resources, but also the waterway, right? Here you have the Pacific with all the richness of the industrial Pacific, right? Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Australia, shipping all the new commodities towards the Americas through the Pacific. And here we have this space with no regulation. Then this waterway becomes a really important space for also black markets. And then who controls the river controls these black markets, and mostly markets of illegal issues, right? Illegal things, weapons, people, migration is happening through this river in a very interesting way. And Chinese people that are coming, or Southeast Asians, or Middle Eastern people trying to immigrate to the United States, coming through this territory, using this waterway to get closer to the north. Is a very particular situation, and the communities are suffering very much. Any question, comment? I just wanted to share with you that this film was made a few years ago. Más Arte, Más Acción, More Art, More Action, that is the NGO that was co-founded by Fernando Arias. They have been working still in Atrato, and then they have several projects, very much like in the same fashion as Casa Rio, River House. They work like in a series of projects with a series of strategies in which art suddenly evolve of becoming a tool for social relations, for visibilization of particular issues happening in this case in this space, one of the last projects is called Atrato, precisely, and is a number of collaborations made by artists from Colombia and from Switzerland, doing residences in this location, several spaces of this territory, doing by stages, and the residences take place in many forms, because it's not only artists but activists, environmental organizations that come, stay and live within these communities and address different issues, from nutrition, for example, through very housing, through just musics, etc. Right? It's just putting people in contact to try to develop the social connections. Then it's a very interesting series of collaborations that they had developed across this river. And they have, as I'm telling you, dozens and dozens of projects that are trying to expand artistic practice. And this is something that is interesting that I wanted you to hear from Fernando. As 1 week ago, we hear from Alejandro. Alejandro is not only an artist, he's a lawyer too. I mean, he was a lawyer, he became an artist. And in his talk, he tried to show us all this very interesting and different kind of ways of how art and activism meet, right? And somehow develop ways of recreation. And at the end, for him, for Alejandro, policy, right? A law, right, is something that is really important, right? Governance over a territory, because the place doesn't have it, or it's not really well suited. In the case of Fernando Arias, he is the son of 2 medical doctors. Then he is very engaged with issues of health. Then it's really interesting. He is not a medical doctor. He's a visual artist. But he's always looking to create these bridges in which people from multiple disciplines get together and look to try to recognize each other. And at the end, what he's trying to achieve is the well-being of both through the encounter, right? How someone like you, living in the delta of the Yangtze River, in the highly developed east coast of China, can come to the Pacific coast of Colombia. And by the encounter with the space and with the people that live in that space, you will be better as a human being. You will achieve something that makes you more healthy in ways and forms. And what you do with that encounters also bring something that community in which you are going to be embedded will be better too. They tried by communication, by encountering each other, will get better. It's not this very unequal exchange that happens in other spaces, right? Spaces of negotiation in which every one of the 2 parties has to win. In this case, they are trying to make an horizontal, flat space in which both parties will gain.
Miguel, if I could make a comment to follow on from your train of thought there. That these works, both of them, Caserío and Más ARTE-MAS ACCION, also emerge out of really dynamic debates in Latin America about human rights and the rights of nature. and then reframing the terms of both of these to create a new concept of citizenship. And this is something that's globally relevant at a time when democracies disintegrate into new forms of authoritarian rule in a capitalist logic, which is incredibly inequitable and exploitative, and at a time of intensifying global warming, leading to all sorts of environmental catastrophe. And so these debates, which are situated within local histories in different Latin American countries, coming out of indigenous traditions, ecological movements, as well as distinct Latin American conceptual art movements and human rights social movements, are all globally relevant as we embrace shared concerns for a very uncertain future. And I think these questions about citizenship and the role of art in inspiring new forms of citizenship at the interface of humans and non-humans is absolutely vital work that these two groups are doing.
I agree 100% with that reading, Robin. Thank you for bringing it up again, because we are the result of our historical gaps, let's say. And if you think about the role of revolution in China, right? How the new Chinese nation came to be as the result of an anti-colonial stand, and through somehow shaking away a history of imperial domination by certain groups within the same nation, created a social movement, right? A new type of citizen that was able to reshape an entire nation to what you have now today. And you are living in that utopia. Many of the things that these artists and these people in Latin America are facing is somehow realizing that these forces, historical forces, are still playing really heavily on the everyday life of the people, the citizens, that are not fully recognized as that because of those forces, let's say colonial or neo-colonial forces, are still in place very heavily within these ideas of nations. And somehow, by looking at nature in opposition to this idea of culture, right? Culture as the idea that reason is the one that is giving us the power over the creation, over nature, organizing the chaos that exists in nature. That idea is wrong. That actually what makes sense is to understand our relationship with that space as one, as a relation, right? Not as a way in which I can take away the resources of that space in which I live. That's why both groups, Casa Rio and Mas Arte in this case, are really aware of the communities and something that the communities have that we, in this process of modernization, lost. That is traditional knowledge, respect to the space in which you live, the capacity of being one within the space in which you are, the respect that you have to give to elders or to people that live in a place without messing that place up. That is challenging these ideas of development or progress, or the idea of growth, economic growth per se, as the engine that mobilizes nations. And in that, a new way of behaving as citizen, as an individual, right? A new way that can emancipate you, can free you from those ties that we have created, this way of looking, this ontological force that put us on top of the evolutionary scale as the kings of nature, and it's not that. Then it's a humbling game. It's a process of de-learning and relearning our relationship with a space. And interestingly, both organizations are located and are acting upon a territory that is larger than the limits, the geographical limits that we impose on those territories as administrative units, right? They're not talking about municipalities or provinces, or no, they are talking about biocultural spaces in which water that flows somehow creates the conditions for a new way of being in that place, a new way of being a citizen, and a citizen without a polis, a citizen without a city. Then in that sense is a fragmented idea or expanded idea of what a citizen is. I don't know if you follow what I'm saying. I hope so. For example, something that was very interesting in Alejandro's talk was the way of using communication, right? Here we're talking about art, but art becomes something else. It's not this idea of art that we have as the manifestation of human ingenuity, right? This idea of, this is a very Kantian, very modern way of looking on art as something that deals with the beauty and the sublime, right? Something that has its own realm. Art is something that you enjoy because it put it in a better space, right? It's about sublimation, and that the only ones that can produce art are these gifted ones, right? They are challenging that notion from its basis, saying that art is something that happens in the everyday. It's a way of relate ourselves with the space in which we are and acting upon that. And in order to do that, they deploy all sorts of strategies of engagement, right? As artists, of course, they work with images, with sounds, with words, right? With ideas, with concepts, to try to develop that kind of new understanding of what art should be. Then, for example, as Alejandro was showing to us, publications are a major thing, right? A book is something that still has this status as something that is part of what we call the archive. We believe in things because they are backed by the archive. In that sense, is what is written and has a record, and then is part of a space in which these records become truth. The archive or library, right on, is what gives a status of reality, the construction of reality through intellectual development. Then they do deploy that kind of thing, saying we do produce this, for example, these books that are part of the archive, or we produce video, or we produce audio, sound, and radio, and music, and poetry, etc. We are part of that realm, but what you will find within that is the experiences. These experiences of how to be better than, mejor que, or try to reconceptualize the idea of utopia. This is a very interesting project that ended in these books. That utopia is a nowhere, is not place. But if you can do better, then probably this idea of utopia will become a topia, a place. Then I will invite you to explore many of the projects that this group of people have. They're very incredible projects. And you see they do produce in a conventional way too, right? Books, publications, videos, exhibitions, but everything is based on these exchanges.
I think, you know, what's so exciting about these two artists and the suite of projects that they do that concern social relations and different communities, and encouraging a shift from thinking about art as an object or an individually housed piece of creation to thinking about it in terms of remaking the world. That it encourages everyone to take some sort of responsibility, but to enjoy the emancipatory possibility of imagining alternative realities at a time when, you know, Amitav Ghosh published a book a few years ago called The Great Derangement, which is this great critique of the lack of imagination in political thought and discourse right now, at a time when we need radical imagination. And it needs to be dispersed among all of us in all of our diverse communities.
Exactly. We showed last night a very nice short film produced by one DKU student. The title of the short is Watertown, precisely what I have in my Bachan. Is one of the international students that is trying to find her way in this reality, and then she exposes herself to this space, right? Because as travelers, we're always looking for what is new, right, and big and pristine, and of course, China gives us all of that and beyond, right? The imagination of a new space, man-built space, incredible urban centers, but also the encounter with this, you know, that for many is the past, what you know, didn't make it to the new standard. Then she goes and tries to understand this space, and in order to do that, she finds out that it's not the space, this like pretty streets of this old towns, water towns, what is relevant, but the people that live there. Then the short video, is like 15 minutes, shows some of her interactions with, she's a female, with women that live and work and have been living and working in this old town for many years, and their dreams and what they are doing. Someone in the fish market, or someone in a little store selling coats, or a person that works with handicrafts, and try to find in the relationship, in these interactions that are actually limited by knowledge of the language, of course. Because there are many layers of translation that happens when you are experiencing these kinds of encounters. Imagine yourself going to El Chocó or to Rio Atrato, the amount of translation that will happen for you to try to understand that reality. but just expose yourself 15 minutes from DKU campus to a place like this, and then will be another level of translation, layers of translation happening, right? Not only the fact that they speak another dialect, not patois, the main Chinese kind of language, but the way they relate themselves with respect to the project of New China or Kunshan, as a matter of fact, or this economic region in which you are highly tech and hyper modern. Or that's very interesting. I invite you to go and check the Watertown site. You will have that short film there. And time is running. Then, if you want, Robin, we can share the second short. I would love to hear from any of you about this first film. If you have any question or comment or.
I don't. Does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to add to the discussion?
I have a very small question. I'm wondering, like, I'm pretty attracted to the soundtrack of this art piece. I'm wondering whether kind of music is produced by local people, or whether the instrument used is kind of a local instrument in this area. And also, yes, I saw some sparkling dots, like beside the main screen. I'm wondering the function of this kind of sparkling dots inside this art piece.
Great question, Sally. Thank you so much. You are completely right. I mean, the soundtrack for this piece was made by Robert Leapock. He's a British musician, but he used traditional music. I don't know the sound that you hear. I mean, yes, there is electronic music, but there is the base of the tune or the soundtrack is made by this wooden instrument. It's called marimba. I don't know the translation into English of marimba. That are this little wooden, I mean, any child will have that, like little pieces of metal that you touch with some, like the simplest piano possible. That is an African instrument, actually, that was, that came to the Pacific region of Colombia through the slave trade. And that is still used by this Afro communities, these descendants from slaves that escape and free themselves running into these jungles. And they recreated their ancestral musics through these instruments, these wooden marimbas. And it's the music of this region that is a connection between African sounds, indigenous sounds of the land too, but in this case, Leapock creates, this like symphony that is part of the piece. And the piece is a triptych. You are completely right, Sally, there in that observation. And a triptych, why? If you think about our history, you have these ideas of the sacred, and the sacred comes in trees, in three numbers, or three right, three things, right? The Holy Spirit, Jesus, and God, for example, is the Trinity. But the fact that in the cosmology of many of these communities, you have the underworld, the world, and the heavens, right? The three layers, right? Three is very important. And in art, a triptych, right, talks about a more complete reality, but one that is fragmented, right? That a reality cannot be achieved in one image, but in different segments, right, or different stages, and they create these windows to reality. then yeah, he's playing with that concept that is a very art historical kind of concept of the triptych. And the music, for sure, is a very important piece because we don't have any words or any narrative really behind behind this piece. It's just the flow, right, of the music with the flow of the images that he, things that he encounters. And time and space collapses. He uses archival material with material, right? And time and space is diffused. The only thing that puts it together really is the sound. But yeah, great question, Sally. Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Okay, then now we are going to share this other short film. It's called Abel, and I do have also a personal relationship with this film. The film is about an elder, an indigenous elder from a family or a nation that is called the Nonuyas. He's one of 36 members alive of this community of indigenous peoples from the Amazon that suffer under the rubber boom back in early 20th century. Most of his people were enslaved in order to harvest rubber for the industrial development of Europe, mostly for war purposes during World War I, and then re-enslaved 30 years after for the rubber operations of the US during World War II. He's one of the last members of that community, and he was recently displaced from the jungle, where he lived his entire life, to a city due to the internal conflict Colombia is living. He was displaced when he was already more than 60 years old. And in order to survive, he became an artist because the only thing he had was his hands and his travel back into the jungle. And he was known before going to the city as the notary of plants, because researchers, botanical, ethnobotanic people, or people in botany or in forestry that used to go and do research in the jungle used to use him because he was the most knowledgeable of all the indigenous in that territory of knowing the jungle, the trees, the plants, the herbs. And then he, what he did after being displaced was to start drawing what he knew, basically the trees. Then here is Abell Rodriguez Moinane in his traditional language, Mohage Wiyu.
Yo soy muy tranquilo por todo. No me preocupo, ni me afano, ni siento derrotado, ni nada. Espero que pasen los tiempos. Llegará el momento. Ahí sí, me levanto. Ya de mi nacimiento de pronto fui así simple. Quiera, no quiera, o quiera también, pero no. No me presento que soy el número uno, yo tengo que ser primero, no. También Otro punto que he aprendido es que cada uno tiene su nombre. Cuando lo llama, párese, no responda y vaya, reciba. Y eso soy yo. Me siento como simple. Me siento como que arrinconado, pero estoy pendiente mentalmente. Para reír soy el último. Pero cuando me río sabroso. Mogajellío. Ese es mi nombre.
¿Qué significa?
Tradicional. Nombre propio, como indígenas, del clan Gavilán. Nosotros somos el clan de Gavilán.
Águila, ¿no era?
Águila por eso, pero más correcto le dicen el Gavilán.
O sea, que no vuela bajito, sino...
A lo alto. Entonces es pluma de Gavilán que le resplandece, luminoso, en el sol. Eso significa Mogajellío.
Abuelo, perdón, ¿cuántos años tienes?
73 años, cumplido.
73 años. Son 73 años de experiencia y sabiduría sobre el manejo pleno del medio, de la diversidad biológica.
Eso llevo. Eso es mi competencia. Para eso de pronto Dios me trajo en este mundo para yo tener ese seguimiento. Pues sí, obviamente que lo estoy siguiendo. Como les decía hace rato, no he terminado, no puedo decir que ya conozco mucho, ya domino todo, no. Todavía me falta.
Mi respeto. Ah, bueno. Okay.
Cuando uno está perdido en la montaña se enamora de pensamiento, uno es borrata. Entonces llega usted a una bamba, no es de esta misma, sino de cualquier bamba. ¿Sí? Entonces empieza a golpear. Y suena. Antiguamente los indígenas nunca tienen pelos en la cara, ¿sí? Así que no se afeite porque ya viene curado de pequeño, ¿sí? La leche de este árbol sirve como pañales. A un niño pequeño lo untaban y se echaba en algodón de hormiga, y eso sirve como para sostenimiento de frío. Y la leche también a veces sirve cuando la persona tiene su soltura y que no puede curar, que si curó pero no dio para más, entonces se saca de eso. Y también sirve para aborto. Pues conociendo, sirve para muchos tipos de curación.
Y por ejemplo, usted de las medicinas occidentales, ¿qué opina?
Pues eso ya es como costumbre occidental, pues eso es buena, como ellos, como lo mantiene, como lo utiliza, allá como lo ordenes, como lo ocupa, eso es de ellos. No quito razón, ni me acomodo tampoco. Yo me mantengo con los míos.
¿Con sus qué?
Los míos, el conocimiento mío, me mantengo, no más.
¿Usted
Sí,
no cree en la medicina occidental?
muchas veces no, porque hay cosas que no, o sea, a mí no me interesa, ni conocerlos, porque eso es ajeno. Mientras que yo tengo los míos, me defiendo con los míos. ¿Quién manda? Los hombres no mandan. El gobierno cumple. Porque tiene billetes. Donde hay oro, plata domina el mundo. Es una traición totalmente destructivo, ¿sí? Arruinable. Entonces, ¿qué podemos hacer ahí? Si yo le digo que no se venga, usted saca el pistola y le dice, bueno, la vida o la plata, o cualquier cosa. Entonces, uno tiene que hablar, bueno, eso pasa en el indígena. Eso pasó con nuestros abuelos cuando de tiempo del Perú, en cochería. ¿Sí? Por eso somos huérfanos de eso, de esa contribución. Eso lo vine yo a entender cuando va a ser por todo esto. ¿Sí? Cómo el hombre blanco humilla al indígena. Porque eso no tiene plata, no tiene armas. ¿Sí? Palabras, consentimiento, no vale para ellos. No sé de dónde el hombre blanco inventó cerrar paso del agua, terminar, ¿sí? Y meterles cemento a la tierra, y entonces ahí viene escasez del agua.
¿Qué es dibujar para usted?
Pues nada, dibujar ahí, simplemente sacar una figura ahí y listo. Como dije hace rato, no tiene sentido, no para dónde voy, para qué, de qué sirve, no, solamente una muestra ahí, una figura simple. Hasta ahí veo eso.
Así lo ve usted, pero hay otras personas que le dan un valor casi botánico y científico y muy artístico. ¿Usted qué opina de eso, de esas personas?
Así como lo aprendieron, así como lo enseñaron, así como lo vivió, pues lo toma a esa medida. Eso como persona de cada cabeza es un mundo diferente. Así como yo saco figuras, así como digamos digamos, comparando a ese árbol, pues yo lo saqué de esa figura como está, como es, para que se vea bonito. Y otras personas lo ven y dicen, pues sí, se lo sacó así, pero ¿qué sentido? ¿Cuál es? Mientras que el otro está viendo ya por otro sentido, digamos, como lo siente, lo aprendió, lo oyó y lo conoció, el sentido y la importancia de que tiene un valor, el lujo, o no sé, por otra medida. Mientras que yo lo tengo solamente como por juego. ¿Sí? Y la figura que yo saco, el dibujo que yo hago, no los valorizo, sino que los veo como un lujo. Mientras que otras cosas, ¿sí? Lo que yo valorizo, no lo muestro porque eso está invisible y secreto. En cambio, esta persona está valorizando eso materialmente. Vosotros me dicen que yo soy conocedor de todo, pero yo viéndolo digo que a mí me falta todo. Yo, digamos, como de estudio académico occidental, no sé nada. Pero igual aprendí lo que es mío y lo tengo. Y con eso ha ayudado a muchos, no solo los blancos, sino indígenas también. Entonces, pues aquí, en ese sentido, pues nos falta aprender muchas cosas.